Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Tonight's guest is Heiser for the third time, Dr. Michael Heiser.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's nice to get to talk to you again.
Tell the dear audience about your books, Angels and Demons, tonight, which discuss the nature of these beings and, for what common sense should already tell any educated person, angels are not winged men and women, and demons are not red, fiery, horned beasts with pointed tails and pitchforks.
Yeah, the that's too bad, isn't it? Both of these books are what I'd call drill down books uh, on subject matter that gets introduced in my earlier book, Unseen Realm. So Angels has been out a while, and I did that because I thought, what a novel thought. I thought, it would be nice to have a book where what we say about angels and the Bible actually came from the Bible. So, I thought, it's this is worth the effort, to drill down and give the good guys, the white hats, some stage time, because anybody ever really wants to talk about are demons and the dark side and all that. So, you know, so Angels was born, and then I knew that I'd be following that because you know there's just a great interest, in the other side. So both of these books are taking threads from Unseen Realm and just sort of blowing them up in terms of just the level of detail. So that's what they are. And yeah, in the book I do talk about, in the Demons book I talk about where this horns and tail and all that kind of stuff, where that imagery comes from, but
And
it doesn't come from scripture.
yes, the Greek god Pan, if I remember.
Yeah, yeah, and Pan has a long history. He's most, uh, the Greek version, but you can find back into Egypt, which is kind of interesting. And I didn't put this in the book, but there is one Dead Sea Scroll text that is fragmentary, so I didn't really bother with it. But this last episode of my own podcast, I don't even know if it's aired yet, but the last one I recorded, we did something on Psalm 91 and how at Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, Psalm 91 was grouped with four other psalms that are not in the Hebrew Bible, but they were collectively understood as exorcistic psalms.
Oh.
And in one of those other four, the text is 11Q11. We actually get reference to things that sound devilly. There's a line in there about where somebody's confronting, I think it's David, either David or Solomon or some angel, going up against the demon, and he says, your horns are horns of illusion, and there's this reference to his face and sort of something bronze or whatever, but it's like, yeah, you got horns right in there. But that's the only other place I know, like in Jewish literature, and it's just one line and most of the lines missing. So, but Pan, I think, is where we really get the fodder for what we think of as demons.
And the beautiful people with wings.
Right. Yeah. I I use this as sort of a thing in interviews where, you get these interviews and you only got about, 10 minutes, and they'll say, well, what should we know about angels that we don't already know? And then I'll throw in angels don't have wings. Like there's no passage in the Bible that says angels have wings. And then right away people go to, well, what about, cherubim and seraphim? And that gives me an opportunity to get into the first chapter of the book where I talk about terminology. Angel, malach in Hebrew, is just a job description. It doesn't tell you what a thing is. It tells you what a thing does. It's a role of any particular member of the heavenly host. And cherubim and seraphim are never actually called angels because these are just job descriptions. They're not ontological terms. So that kind of like floors, your average sort of, talk show environment, and it's in a good way, because then it's like, wow, boy, maybe there's some other stuff that we just sort of think is the case but really isn't, and it helps to talk about the book.
And the term malak sounds dangerously similar to the generic Greek slur malaka.
Yeah, well, well, one's Greek and the other one's not, but there are loan words, so I don't know. I don't, I don't know if that's the case here or not, but probably not.
So, but so angel was originally a term that referred to a divine messenger, and who the Canaanites viewed as messenger deities, and has become synonymous with divine beings in general.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mostly the good guys, but also the fallen angel sons of God who rebelled. When exactly did the term angel go beyond Malak?
Well, you get a lot of terminology in the Hebrew Bible. The way I do this in the first chapter of the Angels book is I say, look, you basically have three buckets, three semantic buckets. There are terms that tell you what a member of the heavenly host is. Those are the ontological terms. Those are terms like Elohim. It's just if you're Elohim, you're a member of the spirit world, or spirits, Ruchot. And then there are terms that tell you, sort of sketch out rank. Sons of God is actually one of these. It's language drawn from the royal court, ancient Near Eastern kings. Then you get terms that are job descriptions, messengers that are lower rank. They're not ranking with the sons of God, but they're more specific and in some cases menial, but in other cases kind of dramatic, job descriptions. So those are just a few examples, but you've got 12, 15 terms here. And what happens over time, and we can blame Alexander the Great for this. So, he gets a lot of credit for things, but we'll give him, we'll blame him for this one.
Love me some
When,
Alexander.
when Greek culture spread, because of Alexander's conquests, we enter into the Hellenistic era. And so the world begins to speak Greek, and books begin to get translated into Greek because everybody's reading Greek, at least the literate class. And the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, is one of these. It gets translated into ancient Greek, 3rd, 2nd century or so. It's what's known as the Septuagint, ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And this was something that the apostles used, the New Testament writers used to quote the Old Testament, especially, Paul, because he's writing for Gentiles. So he's not going to be, quoting Hebrew stuff. Nobody's going to understand him. And even the Jewish community, most of those people don't speak Hebrew. The Aramaic is the main language there, but the priestly class obviously knows Hebrew, but that's a narrow band. And so what happens is everything sort of is turns to Greek, and the Septuagint translators, I mean, this was a group project. It's not just one guy or one or two. It's a number of hands here, but they begin to use angelos for just any of these terms from the Hebrew Bible. And that just sort of becomes the way people are thinking about these things. Like the good guys, for the most part, are going to be angelos. Even though they do, like for sons of God, there are parts of the Septuagint where the guy will be very literal. He'll use, it'll be weoi, sons, and then theon, weon, sons of the gods, or sons of weon, theu, sons of God. I mean, you get these literal translations in different parts, but you also get a lot of angel talk that conflates a lot of these terms with this one Greek word, and it works the same way on the other side too. You'll get daimon or daimonion, which is where we get our word demon, used of the whole range of villains, different sets of rebels in the Hebrew Bible. I mean, the worldview of the Hebrew Bible is not just that the world is a mess because of Adam and Eve in the garden. It's the world is a mess because of three primeval rebellions, which are different sets of rebels. There's one individually. There's the serpent figure. He's the first one. Then you got the sons of God in Genesis 6. Then you get, the ones that the sons of God assigned to the nations at Babel, and they become corrupt and they get judged in Psalm 82, so on and so forth. But you get this whole panoply. But for the Septuagint translator, they're daimonion. And they'll also use the same term for idol a lot. Interestingly enough, I don't know if we want a rabbit trail here, but the one word that they are pretty consistent with that doesn't sort of deflect or muddle, what this thing really is they will typically translate Rephaim and Nephilim and Anakim with gigantes, giants. I mean, that's the way they interpret the term. They do not interpret it as fallen ones. The Greek word for that is pipto. So you don't have a participial form of pipto like fallen ones. You don't ever have that. What you have is you have gigantes, or they will transliterate a term like Rephaim. Just use the letters. But that's kind of an exception. The white hats and the bad hats typically during this era, everything's sort of getting funneled into angelos and daimonion, angel and demon. And the church more or less inherits that with the situation in the New Testament. The New Testament, Paul uses lots of different terms. He doesn't just use angel and demon. In fact, Paul very rarely uses demon. What he'll use instead is language of the powers, where the worldview, because of the Deuteronomy 32 worldview that we've talked about before on your show, where you have both human powers, and behind the human powers, you have these supernatural powers, like the Prince of Persia, Daniel 10, these princes over geopolitical empires. Because that's the worldview and that's the case, a lot of the vocabulary there will be rulership, geographical rulership terms. And so Paul will use terms like archon, exousia, rulers, authorities, principalities, powers, thrones, dominions. He has a wide vocabulary that's well beyond demon, even though he does use that. So Paul's kind of an exception, but church tradition has sort of inherited this angel demon thing, and that's how it teaches, and it has taught angelology and demonology, and it loses a lot of the nuancing of what you actually see in the biblical text.
I see. We'll get to demons in a minute, but
I was going to say something funny. It's not really funny, but wasn't the name Lucifer sort of also tied back to Greek, sort of Greek mythology with the Venus, the god Venus?
Yeah, the connection there is conceptual or religious or thematic, whatever word we want to, whatever word is helpful there. It's not a linguistic one, but there will be relationships with certain Greek stories like the ones you mentioned. Lucifer itself as a term is something that comes from the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate. So when Jerome is translating the Hebrew Bible into Latin, this is a term that he uses in Isaiah 14 for Hallel ben Shakar, the shining one, the son of the dawn. And so linguistically, that becomes Lucifer. But the story or a possible storyline behind it, this fall of this luminous, brilliant, astral, celestial being, then you get the Phaethon myth, and you get some of these other sorts of celestial fall kinds of things, or Venus. You get astrological, an astronomical phenomena associated with this. So there is a Greek connection, but it's just not a linguistic one.
Interesting. We'll go with him first. We were going to touch on this later, but Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about that and his role in the Book of Enoch and Second Temple literature.
Yeah, I think these two chapters, Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, are important for, again, understanding the world of supernatural evil, again, the powers of darkness in the biblical mind. And that is actually a minority view in biblical studies. And there are a number of fairly complex reasons for this, but to try to make this digestible on a podcast, what you have going on in Isaiah 14, let's just say, I think Ezekiel's probably easier. In Ezekiel 28, you have, in the Hebrew text, you have some oddities, you have some grammatical oddities. They're not insoluble things. What they are is there's some archaisms. Hebrew's like any other language. It goes through stages, and the development of a language will affect grammatical forms, sometimes vocabulary, sometimes syntax. And there are a few of these in Ezekiel 28. And so scholars bump into these things and they say, this form here doesn't make any sense. It ought to be this when it's that. And so what they do is they look to the Septuagint, and the Septuagint translator did certain things with the Hebrew text he had. And they say, look, we're going to go with what we think that the Septuagint translator was looking at, or the way he interpreted this. And we're going to sort of ditch the traditional Hebrew text. You say, well, what difference does that make? Well, if you're reading the Septuagint, there's a line in Ezekiel 28 that really, this makes all the difference in the world. I'll just read it to your listeners. So we've got here Ezekiel 28:13. If you're going with the traditional text, you have, you were in Eden, the garden of God. Okay, and then verse 14, you were an anointed guardian cherub. And so what's going on in the chapter is there's the king of Tyre, prince of Tyre, king of Tyre, and he is getting excoriated by the biblical writer, Ezekiel in this case, for his hubris. And he's being compared to, apparently, an anointed guardian cherub who was in Eden, and he gets expelled. All right. So if you go with the Septuagint, though, these verses are a little bit different. It says you were with the anointed cherub. Now that makes it sound like the entity being talked to or about is different than the cherub. And so a lot of scholars will take that and say, well, what the king of Tyre is really being compared to here is not the cherub. It's not this supernatural figure. It's Adam. He's the only other one there. And that's actually a mainstream view. And I don't buy that, because my view is that, and again, I didn't make it up. I'm with a lot of people here. It's just that, this is a minority perspective. I think Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14, where you have Hallel ben Shakar, the shining one, the son of the dawn, say, I want to be like the Most High. And then he gets punished and cast down to the ground and all that. I think that chapter and Genesis 3, so all three of these chapters, what they do is have either core behind, lurking behind in a backdrop, a supernatural rebellion in the divine council, in the abode of Yahweh, the abode of God. And so this is viewed as a horrific example of hubris. In Isaiah 14, you get somebody among the divine council, because he's among the stars of God, the stars of El in Isaiah 14. That's classic divine council language. He wants to be like the Most High, and he gets cast down. So that's, again, that feels like a supernatural rebellion. And that is so unthinkable that the writer takes the kind of hubris it would take to do that and throws it in the face of the king of Babylon. That's Isaiah 14. Ezekiel 28 is doing the same thing, but with the king of Tyre. Like you got to be kidding. You're a guardian, an anointed cherub. You sit in the seat of the gods, earlier in the chapter. I mean, you have this special status, this proximity to deity, all this stuff, and yet, you get kicked out. You were a guardian cherub. You were luminous in appearance, and this is classic, the way that divine beings are described. And you get kicked out. Why? If you read Ezekiel 28, it's because of hubris again. And so I think Genesis 3 is sort of the same kind of story. You have a divine being. Eve knows, when the serpent starts talking to her. I mean, any ancient person would know that animals don't talk. I mean, they're not morons. And so, you can go to Egyptian texts, Mesopotamian texts, where divine beings, trickster figures, or throne guardians, which I think is an important one, appear to humans, in serpentine appearance or dragon appearance. So this isn't unfamiliar. What's happening in Genesis 3 is not unfamiliar. And so, Eve and any ancient reader would know that, hey, when an animal starts talking, the gods are up to something, because this isn't normal. We're supposed to know as readers that there's a supernatural presence here, and it's up to something. So what it's up to is it's transgressing the will of God. God wants the humans, to be in the garden. He wants the humans to not eat from a particular tree. And so he tricks, Eve, deceives her into, breaking this covenantal arrangement. in the hope that she'll get destroyed, that God won't tolerate this and he'll remove them and so on and so forth. So I think all three are kind of barking up the same tree. And so, because that's the way again, with a lot of other scholars, look at it this way, I think that it's useful to read all three passages, in a complementary way to get a fuller picture of a supernatural rebellion event in the primeval garden, the garden of God, the mountain of God, the divine abode from the very beginning. We've talked about cosmic mountain imagery on your show before.
Yeah.
So I think these are just useful chapters. I mean, the chapters aren't about, Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14 aren't about Satan. They're not about the fall, but they're barking up this tree. They're using the story of a supernatural rebellion to castigate and caricature kings in their own day for their ridiculous hubris.
Right. And what would be the connection with Canaanite or Mesopotamian mythology? Some kind of divine rebellion?
Yeah, I actually have an article. I don't even know if this is accessible online for free or not. It might be. But I wrote an article on the Ugaritic mythological provenance of Isaiah 14. In the Ugaritic case, which is Canaanite literature, just broadly speaking, you have a situation where El wants to fill the co-regent throne that's been vacated by Baal. And so the deity that's chosen to do this is Athtar, which is an astral deity in Ugaritic thinking in the wider Canaanite world. And what happens is Athtar essentially snubs El's decision. Basically just says, I don't want the job. And hops off the throne. Like, I'm just out of here. And so that story, certain scholars think that story is again a rebellion. It's a snub. It's a saying no to the will of the higher deity, and that is sort of a Canaanite counterpart or a Canaanite backdrop to what's going on in these stories, especially Isaiah 14, because in that scene in the Ugaritic material, you not only have an astral deity doing this, but you have, again, this council language like the stars of God and that you see in Isaiah 14. So there are some connections there. And a lot of scholars have talked about the Athtar incident in relation to Isaiah 14, but I had a bit of a different angle. I mean, there's a Babylonian angle that I don't even get into in the Demons book that I'm still thinking about. So I didn't want to write too much about it, but it's possible that you could have Enlil or Alil, which is a Babylonian, again, rebellion backdrop story to what's going on in Isaiah 14. I mean, it's not perfect. Well, none of them are perfect. I mean, they're always outliers because these are different cultures. But I think, again, they're barking up the same tree. So there are a number of these candidates that might be behind this or sort of a core idea. But I think, look, we're never going to figure that out. At most, or at least, let me put it this way, at least what we can say is that all of these cultures had the same kind of story about a supernatural rebellion in the divine abode in sort of a primeval context. The results of it, are a little bit different depending on what culture you're talking about, but they've all got this story, this hubris event. And I think that's important to recognize.
Okay, and what exactly is this being that we call Lucifer? Is he second to God, and what's his role in the Book of Enoch and Second Temple literature and his relationship with demons?
Yeah,
and was just made up by a bunch of Bronze Age goat herders.
Well, everybody, whether they're herding goats or they're functioning as a priest or some other high class job, everybody in antiquity is going to embrace the notion of a supernatural world, and they're going to presume that it's an orderly world. Why? Very simple. We like order and not chaos, so the gods are smarter than us, and chances are they would like order and chaos instead of chaos. And they order the supernatural world by virtue of the world that they know and experience. This is why vocabulary is drawn from the royal court. Well, the gods are kings, right? I mean, they rule, don't they? I mean, they wouldn't be God. I mean, if they don't rule stuff, what's the point of being a god? So they take, again, a very straightforward notion that the gods are rulers, and then they will analogize by the rulership and ruling relationships they see in everyday life. And then this becomes the way that we talk about, hierarchy and order and bureaucracy, over in the supernatural world. So it's very normal. A goat herder would know what a king is, and he would know what the servants of the king are supposed to do and not supposed to do.
Yeah, brass goes out in the weeds.
And he of all people would know what it's like. I want to say herding cats, but herding sheep. So he would have an appreciation for something orderly and manageable. But anyway, back to the Satan figure. What if you take the cherub language at face value? It's kind of interesting because that would be in terms of a job description, it's not like glamorous, but it is really important because of proximity. Okay, proximity to deity. And the idea isn't that, the God of Israel, the God of the Bible, or any of these other deities, that they can be hurt and they need a bouncer. Okay, that isn't the idea. The idea is that you had throne guardians to protect sacred space from defilement from other entities, or especially icky humans who will pollute sacred space if they ever get there. So it's like an icky factor. It's I'm defiled now. I gotta go take a bath because a human just came into the room. It's this sort of thing. It's not that he's going to get harmed. But if you're a guardian cherub, that does mean you have close proximity. So if we take that language, for what it is, then we've got on the pecking order, okay, kind of a security guard, kind of a low level. Try not to think of Star Trek, I tell people, because they always get killed, But you have, it's not a glamorous job, but it's you get close proximity, and so therefore it's a job that you would think would be desirable, to be in the presence of deity. But nevertheless,
it has a great dental.
Yeah, right. Nevertheless, it's like it's treated with contempt because the being is disloyal. So that's the feel that you actually get for this kind of thing. Now, interestingly enough, in the Second Temple period, this rebel figure from Genesis 3 and these other passages, all of a sudden gets a pretty exalted status. And so people have asked the question, well, why? Like, how did that happen? Because in the Old Testament, you don't get talk about the serpent. You don't even get the term Satan that you see in Job 1 and 2. It's never actually applied to the serpent in Genesis 3 or even outside of Genesis 3. The Satan generally is like a prosecutor. He's actually part of the sacred book tradition, someone who observes humanity and then reports on what humans are doing and what's being done to other humans by humans and that sort of thing. So it's kind of like a stenographer. It's a fairly low level, kind of thing. But again, there's proximity involved there. But this figure all of a sudden gets this bloated, rep. He gets all this street cred. He becomes God of this world, and lots of other, talk like that. The leader of all darkness. Well, how does that happen? Well, I think it actually happens for a couple of simple reasons. We have to realize what they're doing in the Second Temple period. These are Jewish writers. They're looking at the Hebrew Bible, and they're seeing all these data points, and they're thinking like, well, what do we do with that? They're trying to come to grips with the data that they see in the text and create something coherent, a coherent theology, coherent meaning, out of it. And so they look at what happens in Genesis 3 and what are the effects? Okay, he's not a super important guy in the pecking order, but what are the effects of what happens here? Humans lose immortality. What God wants from the beginning, a human family and human partners, to work with him and do things that he wants to get done. That all goes by the wayside. It's demolished. So you have the loss of Eden God loses, the family he wants. Humans lose immortality, and the earth is cursed. Everything is going to die now because of this. And what that means is that this figure who is cast down to the Eretz, to the earth, to the land, to the ground, and Eretz is actually a word that can also be used of the underworld, which was perceived as being in the earth anyway. This being who sort of now has to take up residence in or on the Eretz, he basically owns the whole thing now, because everything will die. Everything will wind up in his lap. As this is why he's perceived as the Lord of the dead. He brings death to everything. And so if this is the result of what you have done, okay, you didn't have a long resume. You didn't have a spectacular, CV. But good grief, dude, this is like huge. What happens as the result of this incident is huge. And so he gets, street cred, as it were, for being the first, and also being just uber destructive. I mean, pardon the pun, but the fallout of what he does has such magnitude that he begins to be perceived as, and I think rightly so, not only the original rebel, against God, but he becomes the ultimate force, the ultimate obstacle to what God originally wanted. Because look at the predicament. For God to get what he wants now, we have the problem of death to overcome. And we have the problem of estrangement from God. There's no family anymore. So humans have to be brought back into the family. Something has to be done so that they don't die. They can have eternal life again. And the rest of the biblical story, I mean, there are more rebellions to come, but what happens is what happens in the storyline is that God is always trying to come back, return to earth, to establish a beachhead, to restore Eden is the theological language. And he does that at various places, places of divine encounter, cosmic mountains like Sinai and Zion, and the tabernacle, which is decorated like Eden, and the temple, which is decorated like Eden, and Canaan, which is described of milk and honey. Eden. Okay, I mean, all of these things mean something. Narrative. It's this ongoing struggle to kickstart and restore what was lost. And so, if you're the one that created all that chaos and destruction, you do become the God, the divine being, the God of this world, because everything is going to land on your doorstep now because of what you did. And so his reputation, because of the fallout, grows. And the Satan figure from Eden becomes, again, the leader of everything that is oppositional to God, everything that is in the way, ultimately runs over his doorstep. And this is why he grows. There's the development of this idea in the intertestamental literature on into the New Testament. But it all derives from data points in the Hebrew Bible. You don't really need external sourcing for this. Again, if you think about it in these conceptual ways, like these writers are doing.
So he's not second best?
He's, I want to say, first worst. Just to rhyme there. I mean, he is viewed as the arch rival. He by no means is the only rival. And this is the problem. This is the obstacle to both of these books. It's that if you sort of grow up in church, or you have a Christian tradition that's you're sort of a deep part of you, a Judeo-Christian tradition, you're only thinking about this character because you've been taught to demythologize Genesis 6. You never see Deuteronomy 32:8 because you're reading translations in English that don't use the Dead Sea Scrolls in the text. So you never actually see what Babel is really about. And you get this notion, you get a very dualistic, kind of notion, even though, Christians who are biblically literate know we're not dealing with real dualism here, but you catch what I'm saying here. You get this well, there's God against this guy. Well, that's actually only part of the picture, but everything sort of gets conflated, to this one figure because we've sort of again been trained not to see the other two.
And there's others such as Belial, Semyaza,
Yep.
Azazel, Azrael, and the Angel of
Yep.
Death, Mestima.
All of these titles, well, I shouldn't say all of them, but you get, I mean, you mentioned a couple really important ones. You got Belial, Beliar, which is just a variant spelling, Mastema, the Prince of Darkness, all these terms that show up in the Qumran material that point to a Satan figure. It's interesting with Shemyaza and Asael or Azael. I mean, how many different spellings does this thing have?
Before you continue, what's the difference between Azazel and Azrael?
Well, depending on what text you're in, there wouldn't be any. Depending on, on other texts, there's a huge difference. Enoch has. I'm still on the fence on this one. I mean, the common view of what's happening in the Book of the Watchers, which is the first 36 chapters of the Book of Enoch, First Enoch, is that we've got two separate rebellion stories, two versions of the Genesis 6 event that have been put into the same book. And one of the reasons why scholars argue for that is you get, I'm just going to say it. I don't really agree with this. I'm not convinced of this, but I'm just going to say it. You get two lead name figures. One is Shemyaza or Shemichaza, and the other one is Asael or Azael, and in some cases, Azazel, which is an altogether different thing. That's from Leviticus 16, but you still get these names. And so let's just use Azael or Asael and Shemichaza. They think these are two separate figures, but they're both presented as the leader of the Watchers, the leader of the sons of God of Genesis 6, those bad guys. I'm really not convinced of that. I'm not convinced that they can't be names for the same entity, because each of these, they're supposed to be, distinct. They what they're called isn't, consistent. They're not always called one thing. So why can't we have a blending of these things? But that's pretty extraneous, to what we're talking about here. But if you're looking at Enoch, Azael is the leader of the Watchers, okay, at least in parts of the book. But that has nothing to do with the Azazel of Leviticus 16, that's well after Genesis 6. So you get similar terminology that in some texts these things will get conflated, and most of the time they're kept separate. But it does happen, and so it creates some confusion. Then for later writers, Christian writers, and beyond the early church stage, these things tend to get mixed and matched and whatnot. I mean, you take a look at something like Enoch and Metatron. Well, how many different identities can Metatron have? I just read an article today, or not an article, the first chapter of Orlov's book Yahuel and Metatron, and he goes through 9 views of who Metatron is. And he says, I'm only taking the ones that I take seriously. It's 9 views.
I've heard before that Metatron was the deified Enoch that was supposed
That's
to
one view.
Lucifer as the scribe of heaven or something.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, what's funny is whenever I hear Metatron, I think of Megatron.
Right.
And there's a Japanese game about it called El Shaddai, Ascension of the Metatron. Have you ever heard of that?
Yes, I have.
Really
and
weird.
so I mean, yeah, they're the creator's going to take one of these views, and then that becomes a game trajectory. It's actually not much different than some rabbi somewhere taking one trajectory and going with it. But you get a lot of conflation of names and characters in ancient texts, and so that's why I answered the way I did. Well, it depends which text you're reading, and even like in the Book of Enoch, like if you're talking about Shemchaza and Asael, like, are they the same? Or are they different? Two sides of the same coin, totally distinct. I mean, there's a huge debate over that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Asael was supposed to be the right-hand man of Semyaza. Some people like to reconcile that.
Say that again, because you cut out a little bit.
No, some people like to rectify that by saying that Azazel was the right-hand man of Semyaza.
Yeah, yeah. That would interest me because again, who knows? But if there's a co-regent structure on the dark side, that would interest me because there is a co-regent structure in terms of like Israelite divine council stuff. So, if I could be convinced of that, that would be kind of cool because then you'd have this mirror imaging thing going on. But yeah, I'm not convinced of that either. I think that it's not going to, God willing, it's not going to become me. But I was going to say somebody needs to come along, and this is like a dissertation waiting to happen. Can these two figures be fused? I mean, is there a good argument to be made there? I feel like there is, but it's not going to be. That would take a couple of years out of my life, and I know I'm not going to do that.
And before we talk about Lucifer's status as the Satan of all Satans, why did God punish the sons of God, the Titans, in other words, and leave Lucifer alone?
Well, I don't think he left him alone. I mean, he didn't imprison him.
Right.
But
why didn't he?
He's too much fun.
He's too much. No, I think that we're not really given an answer to that sort of thing. So we're left to speculate on this. It's one thing to have what he does, and it's irreversible. Okay, everything's going to die now. It's quite another to have this group who commits this transgression, and again, the real bad. How do I want to say this without using the word fallout again? The real harm in Second Temple Jewish thinking of what happens in Genesis 6 is not the weird stuff that we sort of fixate on, like Nephilim and the giant clans and all that stuff. The real harm is the proliferation of depravity. And that is not even really a sexual component. It's about teaching certain points of knowledge that help humans to more effectively destroy themselves. Seduction is one of those, but there's warfare, there's astrology, there's idolatry, there's drugs, pharmacopoeia, all this kind of stuff. So if you, in theory, what was that?
So basically the 60s revolution, but in ancient times.
Right. Yeah. So in theory, if you don't get rid of these guys, this could keep on proliferating. In other words, it could become worse. Whereas the Genesis 3 thing, it's like, well, you can't really get much worse than dead or death. So that's done. And there's no point to locking this guy up, because what's he going to do now? I mean, what's done is done, and everything's going to die, so on and so forth. But in the other case, again, this is all speculative. In the other case, it's like this could even get worse. They could do it again. They could come up with something else, typically the thinking is there's some sort of logic to cutting off or choking off the catalyst to depravity in this way, by locking them up, imprisoning them until the the quote unquote end of days. Now, I think that Revelation 9 describes their release at just before the day of the Lord, what the Bible calls the day of the Lord, which is final cataclysmic stuff. It's part of the apocalypse, and they're specifically let go, and they wreak more havoc on the earth, and then God judges everything, and so on and so forth. So if that's the case, it would sort of lend another element to the notion that if you had let this particular group go, it's just going to get even progressively worse. And so, God said, well, we got to cut this off, because we don't want it to get worse. It's bad enough. We don't want it to get worse. Whereas the other one, it's like, well, again, what's he going to do now? Everything's going to die. So, again, it's all speculative. If you cast it in those terms, and I don't know if those are the correct terms to cast it, but we're spitballing here. If you cast it in those terms, it's like, yeah, okay. If I were God and I, this one can't really do anything worse, but this group can, well, I'm going to deal with this group and make sure that doesn't happen. I mean, you could see that, that kind of thinking going into the whole concept.
Okay. And, Okay, before we go further with that and talk about Satan's relationship with demons, let's tell us about the word daimon, which, like Elohim in the Old Testament,
Mhm.
was a generic term for divine beings in the New Testament. Like a
Yeah.
lot of people get confused about that term and conflate it with demons, like fundagelicals in particular, that are fans of the theory that the pagan gods were demons. You know, when it's not aliens or something, would
Mhm.
take Paul out of context when he says that they were daimon.
Yeah, that daimon is linguistically a neutral term in classical Greek, just Greek in general. A daimon would be like Elohim. It refers to just a supernatural being. And it could refer to supernatural beings at different sort of levels in the hierarchy, all the way from the big guys, like Zeus, all the way down to some little, you know, sort of not, I mean, it's legitimately a supernatural being, but something of really, really low rank, some servant deity or whatever.
A
You'll
Hermes.
see, yeah, well, even less than that. But you'll see this word used of different levels. It's also used of sort of internal aspects of humans. These, like the life of the mind. This internal thing that we're going on, spirit. So it's a very elastic, um, general term. Now, having said that, in Jewish literature, when it is used in the plural, and this actually has some correlation in Greek literature. It's not by percentage. It's not as great of a contrast as it is in Jewish literature. But in the plural, in the Septuagint and in the New Testament, plural daimonion, using the genitive plural there, are always evil. Every time. There's only one reference. I'm trying to remember where it is, where the word daimon in the singular is used in the New Testament, where it's a neutral, kind of reference, but always in the plural. They're always bad. And a lot of people think that the reason for that is, again, let's just go back to Hellenistic Jewish literature. Enoch, of course, was originally written in Aramaic, and it's going to get translated into Greek, just like the Septuagint, Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And since you have groups of rebels and groups of, we'll call them fallen gods, I'm referring now to the Babylonian 30 view, and they're all sinister, and they are connected to idolatry. Since they're plural, and the Greek translators often will use daimonion, a plural form of daimon, for those guys in both texts, Septuagint and Greek Enoch. A lot of people think, well, this is why this pattern is what it is, just because of these translation choices. But the word itself, if you're just going with the word, generally is a neutral term.
Ah. Okay, okay, how did Lucifer slash Satan come to be in control of demons or leading them?
Yeah, you don't get any hint of this,
Since demons are not they're supposed to be disembodied spirits of dead
Mhm.
Nephilim or Rephaim.
Yeah, right. That's the consistent, tradition across the board, and it's also consistent with the Mesopotamian backstory, the Apkallu story, which again I think is one of the reasons why we do have this consistency, because the Second Temple Jewish literature is tracking, on that story. But regardless of that, you don't have a clear connection drawn between what goes on in Genesis 3 and then what goes on in Genesis 6. In the Second Temple period, though, the Genesis 3 figure again gets elevated for the reasons that we talked about. And so there's this notion that because of the corruption, the estrangement from God, humanity is essentially on their own and has to be brought back into relationship to God. In Genesis 4, this plays out with the first murder Okay, and then that's sort of a signal that, okay, now that they're outside of Eden, sin is going to continue, so on and so forth. Then you get these storylines that continue even after the flood about humans are going to do depraved things. Okay, when you have Genesis 6 come along, and that proliferates and accelerates depravity, the notion is that humans who are estranged from God will do evil. And now these agents, okay, demons are part of this picture now because of the Genesis 6 thing, are going to continue to propel humanity on this path. And so that began to be perceived as the sort of unity point between two agendas. That you have, again, the evil class of being that generates from Genesis 6, the demons, essentially solidifying, or I don't want to say making permanent because death is already permanent, but they are basically ensuring that humanity doesn't turn back to a relationship with the true God, and therefore doesn't ever get redeemed and doesn't get everlasting life, because the effect of pursuing the life of sin, okay, a life of depravity, is going to cut humans off from redemption. The perception was that the demons are in league with the Lord of the Dead. And so the Lord of the Dead would take priority because, again, he was the first, and what he does affects the entire, not just the humans, but the entire planet. So he's still the top dog. But then there's this perception that what this second group is about, they're sort of on the same page. They're following the same agenda. They're assisting in preventing humanity from getting redeemed and having this whole thing reversed. And so again, if you look at it that way, you can see how someone looking at the Old Testament, at what happens as a result of these rebellions that are described, if you look at it that way, you can see the notion appears coherent, even though it's never explicitly stated. But it appears coherent that, okay, these two things do work in concert. They do work in tandem. There is a logic to it, again, even though it's never explicit. And so that forms kind of a new interpretive trajectory drawn from the data points of the Hebrew Bible that gets picked up on and carried through into the Second Temple period and on into the New Testament.
Yeah. I was wondering, a typical case of angels that's commonly brought up in the Old Testament is, of course, with Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot and his daughters, that story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Generally speaking, we have, like in the story, you have Lot offering up his daughters, and I was wondering, does that sort of say how the relationship with angels and people have been portrayed in some parts of the Bible, and like, is that part of a continuation of a sort of a relationship they have? And yeah,
go ahead.
Oh, and basically, how does this relate to righteousness? Because Lot was called righteous, even though with the whole giving up his daughters thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll start with the first one. You don't have, Lot does offer his daughters, to the men of the city. He doesn't offer them to the two angels, but he does offer them to the men of the city to protect these angels. And so, this goes back to this long and, your audience needs to remember this the next time they talk about cultural equivalence. This long tradition in Middle Eastern culture of elevating visitors, elevating hospitality above even your own family members. That's real. I mean, that's really an idea across the board in Middle Eastern cultures. And so what Lot does to protect his visitors, to quote unquote show hospitality, is he offers his daughters to these men, hoping that that'll take care of the problem, which is horrific, but that is the cultural thing to do. we're not really told what vexed Lot to begin with. What was it having to do this? Was it having to leave? Was it just the general sin of the city? Again, we don't really know. So it's kind of hard to know what point to correlate his vexation with and which points to not correlate his vexation with. It just says he was vexed, okay? By the wickedness or, just generally the city. I mean, that's a starting point in my head, but it leaves, questions unanswered.
And here's the
But I want to get to the other sexual element, because there are a number of scholars, who think, they look at this, and it's like, okay, when his daughters, get him drunk and commit incest with him, so that because they're without husbands, and again, we don't understand the magnitude because of our culture. We don't understand the magnitude of this culture for women in not having husbands. Basically, if you don't have a husband, you are either going to just die of exposure or you're left to a life of prostitution. It's just not a good situation, for women. And so they're thinking, we need husbands and children, or not husbands, but we need children that are going to be within the family name that attaches us to the family of Lot, and so, and we're going to be okay. And again, we don't understand the sort of patriarchal worldview and culture, especially the situation that it puts women in antiquity. But they do this, and scholars have thought, out of this episode, when they get their dad, to sleep with them, what do we get? We get the Ammonites and the Moabites. And interestingly enough, those two places are going to have giant clan populations later. Now, they're going to get wiped out by the descendants of Esau. This is Deuteronomy 2 and 3, before the Israelites ever get to the Transjordan where these people settle.
Oh.
I mean, God is specifically going to say to Moses and Joshua, leave the Ammonites and the Moabites alone. The descendants of Esau came in there. They already took care of the problem with the Rephaim. Just keep going up. And God is specifically leading them through the territory of Moab and Ammon all the way up to Bashan. Why? Because that is where the last of the Rephaim live.
A lot of people don't know about the Esau descendants taking care of them.
Yep. It's easy to read over it, but Deuteronomy 2 and 3. And so scholars look at this and go, you know what? In hindsight, you can look at this episode and say, that this behavior is actually a mimicking of what happened earlier in Genesis 6, even though it doesn't involve, the angels. It's a sexual transgression that leads to, this stuff going on. Now, again, I'm not married to that view. It is a view in scholarship. I'm still wondering about it because, just for the sake of your audience, just so that they know that they're interested. There are people who wonder if this is the point of Genesis 19, is it also the point of Paul's comments in Romans 1? Is there something to be said here in 2 Peter 2 when Peter mentions the angels that sin and then also loops in the Sodom story? Is the point here with the men beating on Lot's door to get after the two angels that they think are men, instead of just instead of it being about a homosexual relationship, is it actually about that kind of relationship with angelic beings? In other words, is it another mimicking of Genesis 6 in that way? So there's a lot of stuff floating around in Genesis 19 that people wonder about because of how it plays out in Israelite history.
Also, I think we keep going all over the place, but there's also a certain legend or something you might want to call it that says that Azazel, or Azrael as they call him, ended up being Esau's guardian angel.
Yeah, I've not heard of that. I've not heard of it. Can you pull that out of your head what the source of that is? Like what, a text or something?
I don't know, because
that would be interesting.
I briefly came across it on Wikipedia, but Wikipedia is generally garbage. So,
it could be looping into something worthwhile though. That's interesting. I'll have to look at that. That's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, generally with the whole Lot and his daughter story, I've always like to emphasize the notion of how, because I think that's a problem that I get with a lot of evangelicals, where they don't sort of get how important hospitality was in the ancient times.
Mm-hmm.
And the
Yeah,
fact of the matter is, and the fact of the matter is with hospitality is that there was often a connection with, that it could always possibly be a deity that could be trying to test you, to see what you would.
Yeah,
And
yeah. No, I follow what you mean. Yeah.
and if you don't, because I think I've noticed this happens in Greek mythology, and this is a common theme where basically you'll have a deity or you'll have one of his messengers come down and, basically test the citizens to see if they'll be hospitable. And when they're not, they just wipe out the city. So,
well, the idea generally gets picked up in Hebrews 13, where he says, don't neglect, to show hospitality to strangers because some have entertained angels without knowing it, so that the idea of a visitation being kind of, lurking behind hospitality, maybe there's a connection there.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a good thing to notice, because if you do insert that into the Lot story, and obviously people would have known that, like even people of Sodom and Gomorrah would have known that sort of thing, where there could be a messenger lurking, but yet they just still didn't care. They still wanted to do what they wanted to do. So that adds a sort of another layer to it.
Yeah, it makes it even more heinous, if that's the case.
I just think it's an interesting food for thought sort of thing to just think about with the culture.
And let's talk about one of the most mysterious figures in the Old Testament, the Prince of Persia, like not the game series, but the being in Daniel. The background of that vision from the man who claimed to be Daniel is mystifying already, but even more so that it would take the combined forces of Michael and Gabriel to hold him off. Like, we already know that Satan is Angra and Ahriman in Zoroastrianism, so that would make Dahaka or Zahak the Prince of Persia.
Yeah, I don't think that we can... I'm not sure at all that we can say that Zoroastrian or other Persian writings were influenced by Daniel, or that the writer of Daniel got that information from the Zoroastrian stuff, because the whole notion in Daniel 10 that you have these supernatural beings attached to geopolitical empires is very clearly from Deuteronomy 32, which has nothing to do with Zoroastrian stuff. I mean, it's a lot older. That there's anything generally anything to hang on there. Now, if the context is Persia, it's conceivable that you could have readers of the material make the association, that you just described. I mean, that's just going to pop into their heads. But I doubt that this is what Daniel, the writer of Daniel, is actually thinking, because the pool from which he draws for this is, I think, very, very demonstrably Jewish, and not Persian.
Let's concerning demons, they're not Lucifer's underlings, or are some of them under his control, or a lot of them act alone, or what's the deal on that?
Yeah, I'm one that suspects that we have, we have titles, like Satan being the god of this world. He's the prince of the power of the air. I mean, you get these lofty titles. You do get a sense, because this is going to sound, I don't want it to sound silly, but it might come across that way. But since demons are these disembodied spirits, where do they live? Well, they live in Satan's house. They live in the underworld, okay? And so it's like he's dad, Okay, he's the boss. It's his roof. You're under my roof. You're going to do what I say. So there's this kind of, again, setup just to who they are and what their domain, what their point of origin in terms of, where they leave, for work every day. It's from this place. It's from the underworld. So given that set of circumstances, it would not be surprising to have Second Temple Jewish literature and the New Testament characterize them as though they're working for Satan or they're under his authority, just because of the conception of where they're from. You don't have an explicit statement like that until you get into some of this literature, and even then, it's not terribly explicit as to what the hierarchical relationship is, but it's certainly implied, it's certainly suggested that this is the case. So I think, again, a lot of this, I think your audience is going to be, detecting this and has long detected it already in this interview. A lot of this is about how you frame the data. In other words, what do you do with the data points, and what is your trajectory when looking at the data? How do you assemble these points? And honestly, that's what they're doing. That's what they're doing in the Second Temple period, and they're trying to reason with the data and have some sort of coherent picture emerge. And not everybody's on the same page. You'll read different texts, even among the Qumran stash, but certainly within Second Temple literature, not everybody's in lockstep here because they're all thinking about the same set of data points, and somebody might just go off in a different direction or look at it a different way. But that's what they're trying to do.
And to use an example of a famous Nephilim, it seems overwhelmed, or Nephil, what exactly is the word in the singular?
If in Aramaic it would be Naphilah, that would be definite, the giant, but Nephil without the definite marker.
Oh, okay. To use an example of a famous one, there seems overwhelmingly likely that there was a real Hercules, before the collapse of the Bronze Age, during the glory days of ancient Greek mythology. In this instance, when he died, his spirit became the demon Baal Melkart, who was worshipped in Phoenicia, or is that too simplistic?
Well, I don't know that I'd say it's simplistic, because Hercules, he dies, and then he joins the pantheon and blah blah blah, so on and so forth. So there's this sense of a very active afterlife, and he does get elevated. Okay, he does get elevated to, or maybe I shouldn't say elevated, identified.
Like he's considered much
Melkart,
with man in Greek mythology.
Yeah. I mean, he's certainly identified with Melkart at Tyre, and so there are clear connections, in what you just described. I mean, those are demonstrable connections.
Okay, what is the identity of the horsemen of the apocalypse? You mentioned some time ago that one of them, Famine, was Reshef, if I remember. If so, who would be war, conquest, and death?
It's only the fourth horse. If you go to for your listeners, this is Revelation 6. You get the four horsemen. You have the one of the four living creatures say with a voice like thunder, "Come, look, behold a white horse. Its rider had a bow, and the crown was given to him." So that's the horse of conquering. And then the next horse, he's given a sword as well, to slay. It's warfare again. Then the third one comes along, and that's famine. So now we're getting into a little more of a familiar picture with what you just talked about with Reshef, but it's really the fourth horse that actually has the most correlation with some of these Old Testament passages. So the Revelation 6:7 says this: "When he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, 'Come,' and I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him, and they were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with the sword, with famine, pestilence, and wild beasts of the earth." Well, you've got in a passage like Habakkuk 3, there's several passages. There's Habakkuk 3, there's Psalm 91, which we mentioned a lot earlier. There's Hosea 12, I think it's 12:13. Let me just look that up really quickly, but there's a really important passage that's pretty significant. Let's see, or is it 13:12? Let me look here. Oh, it's 13:14. So you've got, and 13:14 mentions Sheol, death, plague. So you get 3 of the 4 that were just mentioned. In that passage, you get 2 or 3 from Habakkuk 3. You get a number of these things, and they are all in the Old Testament. They are all names of deities. All of these, all 4 of them. Death, that's Mot. You've got Resheph, you've got Ketev, you've got Dever. So the 4th horse kind of sounds like those things from the Old Testament. The other 3 don't really. They're too generic actually, but the 4th one actually does, sound like this. So I don't know if that provides an identification, because you actually have multiple personalities there.
Yeah, like so, every pantheon has a god of war, and
yeah.
Yeah.
But the 4th horse seems to combine all these, or at least not all of them, but 4 of them anyway. So it's kind of interesting. It does borrow an Old Testament descriptions.
And if we're going with the Greek, death would be Thanatos, and Hades follow with him.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, the underworld, of course. Yeah, it makes sense.
All right, Brass, questions?
No, I'm pretty good for right now. I thought it was very interesting to get to talk about the hospital.
You gave me a list of questions earlier.
Oh yeah.
I don't know if you guys. I guess you can cut this out, but I don't know if you guys picked up background noise, but if you did, that's my wife wanting to get into the room. So we should probably wrap it up.
Yeah. I mean, that's fine. That's what I was going to say. All right. Well, it was nice talking to you, Michael Heiser, or Dr. Heiser. So, once again, like we always do, you want to tell the audience where they can go find you and any projects that you want them to know about before you head out.
Yeah, the homepage is dr as in doctor, MSH, so drmsh.com. That's kind of the nerve center. You can find pretty much everything I've got a hand in on that website. For books, Amazon.com is the place to go. So we talked about angels tonight. We talked about demons. We mentioned Unseen Realm, because again, these 2 latest are kind of drill downs. Your listeners might be interested in a real little book that I wrote called The World Turned Upside Down, Finding the Gospel in Stranger Things, the TV show, which I love. It's great storytelling, and good storytelling maps to good storytelling. So the biblical meta narrative is shockingly similar to the threads in Stranger Things, and so I love the show. So I wanted to do a book like that. Really to get people to look at the show, fans of the show, might appreciate the depth of it a little bit more and how it maps over to some of these, spiritual things.
How would you like Game of Thrones depictions? There's episodes that depict their gods as being similar to Canaanite gods that required a sacrifice of children and stuff like that.
Yeah, see, I mean, all of that. I mean, this is the pull from which all of this stuff is drawn. And again, the popularity of that show is what it is, for a lot of reasons, but ultimately it's good storytelling, both, in terms of good and evil. And so I think a lot of that stuff is deliberate. I will say, with Stranger Things, I think there are a real small number, deliberate things. The part that's really interesting to me, and I think this would apply to Game of Thrones as well, is the places where they're not trying to specifically mimic something. It's just there. and again, I think the reason for that is because you have the same archetypes running through both sets of, both worlds essentially. You have the fictional world and this more ancient, material. I think that's really interesting because it just shows the depth and the broadness of these elements that just make up good stories. So I actually track in the Stranger Things book on the stuff that I don't think is intentional at all. It's just there. And when you see it, it's like, wow, how'd that happen?
It's not like Lord of the Rings where it's subtle, but it's definitely there.
Right. I think it's fair to say it's a little more intentional. And it's even more intentional when you get to something like C.S. Lewis, with the Chronicles of Narnia.
Yeah, it's like in your face.
Yeah, it's very intentional there. But they were students, of comparative mythology and these tropes and these archetypes. They're just there, and yeah, you should use them because it's good stuff.
Yeah.
If you want to create something, people are actually going to gravitate toward and really, appreciate, then that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's similar to Wonder Woman, which had clear Christian allegory in it. Like Zeus was supposed to represent God since the Stoics did that. They identified Zeus as the prime mover.
Yeah,
and Ares.
We could go on and on with this, but a lot of the Marvel universe, the DC universe. I mean, a lot of I don't know if you guys have ever read the book, and I'm just going to say this because I do got to get going, but I don't know if you've ever read the book, Our Gods Wear Spandex.
Yeah, you mentioned that before in the previous episode.
It's just full of this kind of stuff, and it's fascinating.
Then where I was getting with Wonder Woman is that Ares is supposed to represent Lucifer, and Wonder Woman is supposed to be a feminized Christ or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it was nice talking to you, Dr. Heiser.
Yep. Good to talk to you guys.
Mm-hmm. You have a nice night. Okay?
Yep. You too. Bye-bye.